Welcome everyone, Croeso, we say here in Wales. I'm Raluca Lesko, Director of the Centre for Arthurian Studies, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the first speaker in this new series. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Potter, very well known to all of us for his work on Arthurian romance, or editions of Gawain the Green Knight, but also more extensively work on multilingual England, and his latest project focuses on that. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that today. It's great to see so many of you in the audience, and I will hand over to Ant now. Thank you, Ant.
Thank you very much, Raluca, for that introduction, and a great pleasure to be a guest of the Arthurian Centre at the University of Bangor. And it's especially nice to see in my audience some of the people who helped me in my research for this paper. This is a shorter version of an essay that's coming out in a festschrift for the great Jane Taylor. And I would particularly like to thank Keith Busby and Leah Tether, not just for being here, but for helping me write the piece and do the research. It was done in lockdown, so I needed a lot of help in terms of having PDFs sent and so on. Thank you very much for that help. So let's begin with my topic, which is the circulation of Chrétien de Troyes' Arthurian romances and the continuations. In medieval England and Scotland, people in Bangor will, of course, be struck by the omission of Wales here. I apologise for that, and it's certainly not a sign of disrespect for medieval Welsh literature, or a sign that I'm ignorant of the fact that there are many Welsh Arthurian tales that appear to be based on Chrétien's romances. But I'm not myself a speaker of Welsh, and I don't think you can expect to contribute anything meaningful to scholarship if you can't access texts in the original language. So I hope to be educated about the circulation of Chrétien de Troyes in Wales and the questions and answers. But I have not myself wanted to include Wales for this reason. The question of the popularity of Chrétien de Troyes, everyone who works in Arthurian literature knows his name. He's the founding father of Arthurian romance. But the question of whether his romances were popular in medieval England and Wales hasn't really been looked at systematically. It's been touched on briefly by Dieter Mail when writing on English court culture, and he writes the following: "It can be said even of the first centuries after the Norman conquest that courtly culture and society was less exclusive. The influence of Chrétien de Troyes, for instance, was not very far-reaching, and even during the 12th century, the Anglo-Norman poet Hugh de Rotelander portrays chivalry and courtly ceremony with a certain degree of detached irony. This applies even more to the 13th and 14th centuries, the period in which most of the extant Middle English romances were probably written." Well, if what Dieter Mail wrote was true, then this talk would be a lot shorter than it is. But the situation, as we shall see, is much more complicated. There is, in fact, evidence of various kinds. These evidence ranges from lost manuscripts and extant manuscripts, allusions and borrowings of Chrétien de Troyes in literature and art. And then, of course, there are translations and adaptations. And cumulatively, this evidence shows that Chrétien and the continuations circulated widely in medieval England and Scotland, with perhaps the added surprise that Chrétien de Troyes remained popular in England, perhaps even for longer than he did in France. So our exploration of the evidence here should begin with a rejection of what I think is a crude distinction between court culture on the continent and continental court culture and English court culture. I do not believe it is really the case that court culture in England was less exclusive than it was on the continent. The important thing to stress about court culture in the Central Middle Ages is that it was international, transnational, and in Western Europe, the most exclusive and internationally mobile court was that of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And it's not surprising that Henry's English court was itself known to Chrétien de Troyes. As many scholars have noted, the description of Eric and Enida's coronation feast in Nantes harks back to the court that was held there in 1169 by Henry II to mark his betrothal, the betrothal of his son Geoffrey to Constance, daughter of the Duke of Brittany. For instance, the list of guests at that wedding feast in Eric includes the historical personage Brian of the Isles, otherwise known as Brian of Wallingford, which is a place near Oxford, as Chrétien knew, for in Cligès he places the tournament devant Oxenfort, qui presse est de Gallingfort, i.e. Oxford, which is near Wallingford. He knew quite a lot, did Chrétien de Troyes, of English geography, and it's been, people have speculated he may even have visited. It's interesting also at that wedding feast that when Chrétien outlines the dominions from which Arthur summons his barons, he is actually describing the vast expanse of Henry II's empire. And here comes a passage from Eric and Enida. You have the original here, and I will just give you a translation of that passage. There were many counts and kings, Normans, Bretons, Scottish and Irish. From England and Cornwall, there were many powerful barons, and from Wales to Anjou, and from Maine to Poitou. There was no important knight or fine lady and noble lady that the best and worthiest of them were not present at the court of Nantes. And the place names map on to the area that you see in red here, which is this is the Angevin Empire, Henry II's empire in the continent. Henry II obviously played some role in the making of Eric and Enida, though if he was the patron of Eric, as has been suggested, we might have expected Chrétien to have done him the favour of naming him. Maybe it's the explanation for this really rests on the family ties between Chrétien's first named patron, who was the Countess Marie of Champagne, daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Henry II, Eleanor's second husband. These ties between the Counts of Champagne and Henry II were so close that Chrétien's connections with the English court can be explained without assuming Henry's personal patronage. So in Chrétien's own lifetime, we can see that there were connections there between England and Chrétien de Troyes. Let's now look at the literature of medieval England to look for the evidence of Chrétien's influence. I find no trace of Chrétien's influence in early Middle English literature. But the explanation for this is that the literature of entertainment in courtly circles in England was in French and not in English. So to measure Chrétien's influence in England before the 14th century on the literature, we need to turn to literature in the French of Britain. I think the earliest romance that seems to show his influence is Hugh de Rotelande's Ipomedon, which was probably composed shortly after 1180. Hugh de Rotelande was from Rhuddlan, and he tells us in his poem that he lives in Credenhill, just north of Hereford. Two other individuals named in the poem, Walter Map and Hugh of Hungary, were canons of Hereford Cathedral and personal acquaintances of Hugh. The action of Ipomedon takes place not in Arthurian Britain, but in the Sicilian realm of King Meleager, and while the characters are not Arthurian either, Hugh's chivalric world bears more than a passing resemblance to Chrétien's imaginative universe. For instance, there is a tournament in which the hero fights incognito in different colours on different days, as in Chrétien's Cligès. There is a knight without name who willingly incurs shame out of love for his lady, which reminds us of Chrétien's Lancelot. There is a maiden who arrives at court to challenge the knight to raise a siege, which reminds us of Chrétien's Perceval. And what Dieter Mayo calls the detached irony with which Hugh de Rottelande treats his protagonists seems to me not evidence of a less exclusive attitude that separated England from France, but it reminds me of a quality that Hugh and Chrétien had in common. Scholarship is divided on the question of whether Hugh de Rottelande used Chrétien's romances, and the most recent editor, Anthony Holden, leaves the question open. This is perhaps the most judicious pronouncement on the whole question. He writes, I've translated this, the original is in French. Of course, it seems accepted that Meleager's court is modelled on King Arthur's. Almost no convention is missing. We encounter the venerable sovereign, arbiter of good manners and fount of wisdom, valiant and energetic in theory, but in fact passive and little inclined to act when the inevitable adventure arrives. We also encounter the king's nephew, Capaneus, equals Gawain, the boastful, bad-mouthing and sarcastic seneschal, Caemeus, is K, and even secondary characters such as Sicianus le Désraillé, Désraillé meaning impetuous, Saint-Grémor the impetuous. But on the other hand, it is also evident that a familiarity with Arthurian conventions need not necessarily imply in 1185 the direct use of Chrétien de Troyes. What Anthony Holden has in mind is that at this period, of course, we see other Arthurian romances and tales being written, as for instance Marie de France's Lanval. And it's true that many of the apparent echoes of Chrétien de Troyes may well be stock Arthurian conventions. The 3-day tournament that I mentioned also appears in Parthénopeus de Blois, written sometime in the last quarter of the 12th century, perhaps before Hippomedon. I think the only question that Holden here doesn't really address is where Hugh de Rottelande in 1185, when he was writing, could have encountered Saint-Grémor le Désraillé, with that memorable epithet, the impetuous, if not in Chrétien's romances, because this character, Saint-Grémor le Désraillé, is a fixture in Chrétien's romances. He typically occurs there with his epithet, but he has no standing at all in earlier Arthurian romances or in non-Arthurian literature, and I know of no other texts that mention him before the continuations and the Vulgate cycle, and these are both later. So I'm inclined to the view that on the balance of evidence, I think Hugh de Rottelande did know Chrétien de Troyes' romances. We now go to a slightly later period, the early 13th century, when I can think of 3 romances that show influence of Chrétien de Troyes. They are Ider, Guy de Warwick, Guy of Warwick, and Fergus. These all show familiarity with Chrétien, and I'll just deal with them very briefly, one by one. The Romance of Ider was probably composed somewhere between 1199 and 1216. The dialect of the surviving manuscript is markedly Anglo-Norman, and the geographical setting of the romance leaves me in no doubt that the romance is insular. I have this passage here, which is almost comical in its local detail. King Arthur holds court in Pontefract, and the wild forest that is home to dangerous giant is pathetically English. Here is Gawain explaining where this wild forest can be found. It is near Worcester, she said. Oh no, it's not Gawain explaining this, it must be a damsel. It is in the Malvern Forest, which lies above the Severn Valley. Sir Gawain, said the king, sir, that is in Gloucestershire. I can easily take you there, Sir Kay, if I put my mind to it. So this poet was English, and his knowledge of Chrétien is plain to see. A number of narrative motifs in this romance go back to Chrétien's romances. The hero grows up destitute and fatherless. And when he goes to King Arthur's court hoping to be knighted, the king ignores him. Well, that is exactly how Percival starts his life. In the course of his travels, he receives hospitality from an impoverished knight. That is Eric. That's just the situation as it is in Eric. He encounters a grieving lady holding the corpse of her lover who's been violently killed. That reminds us of Percival. He meets an evil dwarf who shamefully strikes him. Well, that's back to Eric. He then teams up with Yvain and Gawain, who are presented as compagnons, as in Chrétien's Yvain. Now, my second case, Guy of Warwick. Well, the influence of Chrétien de Troyes' romances on Guy de Warwick has already been very thoroughly discussed by Velma Richmond. And I just want to limit myself to one very clear example of his influence. Like Yvain, Guy interrupts a fight between a dragon and a lion. And he comes to the lion's rescue just when the dragon is about to kill it. The grateful lion then joins its paws in a gesture of vassalage and becomes the hero's friend. The obvious parallels between Yvain and Guy end here, because in Guy, the lion is then killed by the wicked seneschal Morgardour. But absolutely no doubt that this poet knew the Chevalier au Lion, or Yvain. And the final Anglo-Norman romance I wish to discuss is the Roman de Fergus. This belongs to the same period as Guy de Warwick, but it takes us to Scotland, where the action is very firmly set. The two surviving manuscripts are continental rather than insular, and Tony Hunt sees no reason to think that the romance was actually composed in Scotland. But the Scottish lowlands are so vividly and precisely evoked that I find it very difficult to imagine an author and an intended audience who were foreign to these parts. D.D.R. Owen has plausibly suggested that the poet, who names himself Guillaume Leclerc, may have been William of Malvoisin, who was a clerk at the court of William the Lion, King of Scotland, and later Archbishop of Glasgow and St. Andrews. Well, we needn't look very hard for parallels between Chrétien de Troyes' romances and Fergus, because Guillaume's use of Chrétien's romances is a very conspicuous element of his literary game. The romance opens with King Arthur holding court at Cardigan. Arthur's knights are talking idly after dinner in the hall, just as they do in Yvain, when Arthur proposes that the assembled company should hunt the white stag. Where have we heard that before? Well, in Eric. After the stag has been caught, Arthur and his knights travel to Carduel. En route, they encounter a country bumpkin, Fergus, who is ploughing the fields, but who, on seeing Arthur's knight, announces to his parents that he must go to Arthur's court to serve him. That reminds us of the young Percival, and so on and so forth. When a romance feeds so blatantly off its intertext, it is rather an understatement to say that the poet knew Chrétien's romances. This poet was really a connoisseur of Chrétien's romances, and he liked nothing better than sharing with his audience the joys of recalling episodes from Chrétien's romances. And I will give you an example. It's a delightful example. It's the scene in which Fergus is armed. The heroes of Chrétien's romances come forward with arms and armour, including Percival, who gives Fergus a sword. And this is the passage on your slide. In the course of his travels, the knight receives hospitality from an impoverished knight, who's described just as Eric's host is. He encounters a grieving lady holding the corpse of her lover who's been violently killed. That's Perceval. He subsequently meets an evil dwarf who shamefully strikes him. That's Eric. And they then teams up with Yvain and Gawain, who are compagnons, and that's Yvain. So it's very clear that that poet knew Chrétien de Troyes. The influence of Chrétien's romances on Guy of Warwick, Guy de Warwick, has already been very thoroughly discussed by Velma Richmond. And I'm going to limit myself to a very clear example of it. It's Guy of Warwick's debt to the whole story of the knight who rescues a lion from being killed by a dragon. The same episodes is there in Guy de Warwick, including that wonderful moment you remember in Chrétien de Troyes where the knight, the lion folds his paws together in offering his vassalage to the knight. Well, that too occurs in Guy. And there, the parallels there between Yvain and Guy, because in Guy the lion is very soon killed by the wicked seneschal Morgadour, but the episode of the knight and the lion is clearly drawing on Yvain. The romance of Fergus takes us to Scotland, and the action of Fergus is very firmly set in Scotland. It mentions some very rather, at least to me, rather obscure place names in Scotland. The complicating factor is that the surviving manuscripts of Fergus are continental rather than insular. And Tony Hunt sees no reason to believe that the romance was actually composed in Scotland. But the Scottish lowlands are so vividly and so precisely evoked that I find it very difficult to imagine an author and an intended audience who were foreign to those parts. And D.D.R. Owen has plausibly suggested that the poet, who names himself Guillaume Leclerc, may have been William of Malvoisin, who was a clerk at the court of William the Lion, King of Scotland. And he was later Archbishop of Glasgow and St. Andrews. And the parallels between the Chrétien's romances and Fergus are really very, very obvious, because really Guillaume's use of Chrétien's romances is a conspicuous element of Guillaume's literary game. I will just mention one episode which I think is rather funny. It's the moment in which the hero Fergus is armed, and then at the arming of Fergus, for the arming, all the heroes of Chrétien's romances come forward with different bits of arms and armor, including Perceval. And Perceval gives Fergus a sword, and I've got this passage on the PowerPoint. He held in his hand a good and sharp sword, which he had been given by his good host, who gave him hospitality. Now, what we are supposed to have in mind here, or to recall mentally, is the scene in Chrétien's Conte du Graal, where Perceval's host in the Grail Castle, the Fisher King, passes on to the hero a precious sword. And then I think there are bonus points for readers who know that scene in Chrétien so well that they remember the curious words spoken by the servant boy who hands Perceval the sword. They are these words: "You may give the sword to whomever you please, but my lady would be most glad if it were put to good use where it was bestowed." Never knew what to make of these lines in the Conte du Graal. Chrétien obviously had in mind a moment where the hero, Perceval, would give his sword to someone else. Well, that moment has come to pass in Fergus. It has come to pass because it's been foreseen in Chrétien de Troyes. Now I come to a different kind of evidence here, not Arthurian romances that show knowledge of him, but other kinds of texts. And I begin with the work written at the court of Edward I. So we're now later on in the 13th century. and obviously Chrétien's romances continue to be in vogue. John of Howden, around 1280, wrote a verse homily entitled Rossignon, and he wrote that for Eleanor of Provence, who was Edward I's mother. And John writes that there were many great heroes, but God, he says, is far greater, and none of the Arthurian knights can rival his glory. And then he mentions the following names: not Gawain, who was without arrogance, nor Lancelot. Oh, I'm sorry, that is a mistake there. That should be ne Lancelot. Ne Lancelot. Keith and Leah, if you're listening, make sure I've got that right in my quote. Nor Lancelot, who was expert with a lance, nor Ewain, who tames his lion, nor Percival, who makes good progress. The brief references to these heroes could theoretically be to other romances, but I think the mention of Yvain and his lion, Yvain qui son lion agence, does suggest that the poet had Chrétien in mind. Edward I's own familiarity with Arthurian romances can also is certainly implied by the Arthurian themed tournament at Lehem in 1278, to which he was invited. This had been organized by the knights Huard de Bazantin and Aubert de Longueval. The latter's sister had the honor of being cast as Queen Guinevere on this occasion, so these was like round table feasts that took place in the medieval period. Count Robert of Artois was to play Yvain, complete with lion. Edward, in the end, failed to turn up for the event, but he had been cast as King Arthur, and his familiarity with Chrétien's Yvain could obviously be taken for granted. The thing about court life in this period is that it often imitated literary art, and kings and princes needed to know their chivalric romances to play the proper part. This explains Edward III's payment for books. Recorded in the Exchequer for 1365, he paid for 3 romances, and I translate, and these books were taken into the king's hands because it was certified to the king that these books related to the solemnity of feasts. Now, these romances that were being read at the king's court in the 13th century would have been francophone. In fact, right up until the 15th century, the great and the good in England still entertained themselves with literature in French. And we have many medieval wills, book lists, and inventories, and they make frequent mention of French Arthurian romances. Most of these references by this time are to prose Lancelots. There is something clearly that happens in book production around about the middle of the 13th century, where prose, the longer prose format, displaces manuscripts of verse romances, and you can see that in the inventories and wills. We have plenty of references to Lancelots. But again, a few of those references are certainly to Chrétien's verse romances. It seems to me, for instance, that the references to books called Perceval et Gauvin, Percival and Gawain, in the book lists. One was owned by Queen Isabella, who was Edward III's wife. One was owned by Richard II. That these books of Perceval and Gauvin I find it, well, I take these to be references to what we might call Perceval and the continuation cycles. These kinds of cyclical manuscripts which combined the Conte du Graal with the later continuations, because it's worth remembering that the Perceval, Chrétien's Perceval, unfinished, mostly circulated in manuscripts with the continuations. It's hard to imagine that a romance called Perceval and Gauvin could refer to anything else than those types of manuscripts. But well, maybe you have other ideas. It would be interesting to hear what you take these books de Perceval et Gauvin to mean. No doubt at all exists about the reference to a Liber de Père de Gallois in the inventory of books in St. Augustine's Abbey, because the compiler of that inventory had the very good sense to provide the incipit. And what this man did, also very sensible, he took the incipits from the second folios of all the books, because what he knew was that in a manuscript, the first folio would often get lost. And so the incipit he records for this book, the Liber de Père de Gallois, is Et oraison, which corresponds with the opening words of line 155 of the Conte du Graal. It seems a bit odd, perhaps, to think of monasteries as safe houses of manuscripts of Chrétien's romances, but we have from the 14th century a remarkable mention of Chrétien's name. This is from a college that's now in Trinity College, Dublin, manuscript 496. I've shown you a pretty picture. It's basically a historical compilation, a miscellany. And it was written and assembled at the Benedictine Abbey of Wymondham in Norfolk. It contains, amongst other things, a copy of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia, and the text that matters for our purposes, a copy of Geoffrey's Prophecies of Merlin. It was written sometime after 1298, because there are allusions to the battle of to some battles that took place then. And at one moment in the Prophecies of Merlin, there is a prophecy that King Arthur's deeds will be food for future storytellers. And then the commentator adds the following. I'll read this to you in an English the English translation there. So remember the prophecy. King Arthur's deeds are going to be food for storytellers, and this is what the commentator writes. The sense is clear and requires no exposition. After all, no one's deeds are narrated as much as his across the whole world, because they are pleasing and charming. I speak here not only of deeds of war, but also about other deeds that were accomplished during that time of tranquility and peace by Arthur and his knights of the Round Table. Such deeds are reported by the French books, written both by Chrétien de Troyes and by others, such as Âtre Périlleux, Le Bel Inconnu, Le Chevalier au Lion, Le Chevalier de la Charrette, Perceval, Lancelot du Lac, Les Enfants Gauvin, and countless others written in almost every language. Well, I wish the same could be said about this guy's writing, as what he says himself. The sense is clear and requires no exposition, because if you look at the Latin, some stuff does need exposition. For instance, what is this romance that he calls De esse pericoloso? Well, I've glossed that as L'Âtre Périlleux, but it must be the case that that the scribe actually thought that Âtre Périlleux, the perilous graveyard, was Être Périlleux, and then he translated Être into esse. De Gualguano Muto is another one, Gawain the Mute one. What could this be a reference to? Mute Gawain. Possibly it is the enfance of Gauvin, right? The childhood of Gauvin, misunderstood as infants, i.e. not speaking. The one thing that is clear, I think, is that when he's thinking about the deeds, when he's thinking about the peace of time and tranquility, he's thinking of that period of 12 years that is mentioned in Geoffrey's history as a period of peace in which strange adventures happened. But it shows an extraordinary knowledge in England of a whole of the tradition of verse romances. And also it shows it at rather a late date, which is perhaps surprising. This was written probably sometime in the early 14th century. When we come to manuscripts of Chrétien de Troyes in England, well, that's rather more disappointing. The haul is disappointingly lower, and there are only 2 manuscripts of Chrétien which are of insular provenance. The first is Harley 4971 from around the middle of the 14th century. This belonged to the Abbey of Bury of St. Edmunds. And making the most of some unused space on folio 127V, a scribe used an empty column to jot down a list of knights that were present at Eric and Enid's wedding. The selection is headed la runde table, and then the item is referred to in the table of contents to the manuscript as sessiones tabula rotunda, sessions of the round table. So I think what we have here is a reader who was historically minded and who wished to record people that had been in attendance when King Arthur held court at Cardigan. A rather typical feature actually that we find in the reception of Chrétien de Troyes, a kind of historical interest. The same historical interest is suggested by the other insular manuscript of Chrétien. That's Arundel 14, a manuscript that contains Chrétien's Perceval. It's not accompanied, unusually, with the continuations in that manuscript, but it is accompanied by historical narratives, by Wassersbrut, by Gaimard's Histoire des Anglais, by Havelock and Langtoft's Chronicles. And the historical core of that manuscript, Perceval included, was copied around the middle of the 14th century. Those are our 2 manuscripts. I want to take one off the list. I had this wrong in my PhD thesis. It's the Smithfield Decretals. Relying on the library catalogue, the British Library catalogue, I assumed that the wonderful illuminations in the Decretals there, I hope you can see the picture there of the knight and the lion, folding his paws together in homage to the knight. Well, with the British Library catalogue, I assumed that these were illustrations of Yvain, but this turns out not to be the case, because the last of the illuminations of the knight and the lion, here it is, shows the lion being killed. And what this tells us is that these are illuminations not of the Knight of the Lion, but illuminations inspired by Guy of Warwick, where, if you recall, the knight is killed by the wicked seneschal. So we just have our 2 manuscripts, and that's not a lot. It's not entirely surprising, I have to say, because the tally of continental manuscripts of Chrétien de Troyes is fairly modest too. Each of his first 4 romances exists in 10 or so manuscripts or manuscript fragments, and really the only romance of Chrétien de Troyes that achieved an impressive circulation, a more impressive circulation, was Perceval. And the reason it achieved a wider circulation was the fact that later compilers saw fit to combine that romance with the continuations, making it into a Perceval and Gawain cycle. Something that Chrétien never intended. The one thing I do want to flag up as something that is interesting is the lateness of the English manuscripts. Both were copied in the 14th century, around 1350, and as far as I'm aware, they represent the last links in a chain of scribal transmission that certainly on the continent had become very tenuous even after the middle of the 13th century. And it may have something to do with the fact that verse first wasn't displaced by prose in in England, and it never really was. And maybe the taste for the Chrétien's verse romances also remained in England longer than it did in France. Now, when around 1350 we have the manuscript transmission of Chrétien de Troyes disappearing, that is nevertheless the moment where, as he disappears from the manuscript tradition, he begins to appear, the reception begins to appear in English literature. And I want to discuss a few unambiguous cases of adaptation and influence of Chrétien and the continuations. And I'm conscious there that I pass over, I'm especially conscious of that, giving this talk in Bangor, that I pass over some cases that seem to me unclear. Did Chrétien de Troyes influence Chaucer? Did he influence Libaud d'Escornu? Did he influence Generides? Did he influence Thomas Malory? There are people who have made the case, and I've put the names there in the bibliography. My own assessment of it is that these are not very clear cases. Field, yeah, of course, that's Peter Field. That's your own Peter Field. So let's go for some obvious cases of influence and adaptation. The clearest case is Ewain and Gawain, the Middle English Ewain and Gawain. Another clear case, I think, is Percival of Gales, the Middle English Percival of Gales. Both these romances were composed in the 14th century. Both are in northern dialects. Ewain and Gawain sticks very closely to Chrétien, and so close that the poet must have had a copy of Chrétien de Troyes in front of him. And this story of Ewain seems to have been hugely popular, and you find it appearing in art, in misericords in English churches. And I've given you on the slide, I think this is the one on that was used on the poster. The scene, what you see here, is the backside of Ewain's horse, sliced in half by this portcullis, which has come down. That wonderful scene in Chrétien's Yvain. It is very popular with artists. It's found in churches all across England. This doesn't mean, of course, that all these artists knew Chrétien, or possibly the Middle English adaptation, Ewain and Gawain. Because what happens, I think, is that these iconographical motifs very soon start to lead a life all of their own, independently of any written text. But it's pretty clear from the presence of these motifs in art that the story must have resonated, at least with some artists and audiences. Percival, the Middle English Percival, is slightly less straightforward in that it is a much freer adaptation of Chrétien de Troyes. As I see it, the Middle English poet wanted a shorter story. He wanted a story with a happy ending, and he made drastic revisions to achieve this goal. If you want a story that is short, don't introduce a grail. Stories with grails never end. He also kept Percival's mother alive, and then he tied up the plot by having young Percival return to his mother near the end of the story. Because Chrétien's Conte du Graal circulated in manuscripts with the continuations, the influence of the continuations is also relevant to our topic, and I mention here Sir Gawain and the Green Knight because the plot of the beheading game comes from the first continuation of Chrétien de Troyes. In the first continuation, Arthur holds a plenary court. He refuses to have his meal until some great marvel arrives, and then the poet promptly obliges by serving up an adventure. A strange knight comes riding in on horseback and offers a game. If anyone wishes to cut his head off, he will in a year's time return the favor. And Caradoc, who's the hero in this episode, steps forward, beheads the knight, and then the challenger, there we go, goes after his head and puts it back on. The head flies far away from him, but the body follows it so closely that before anyone could prevent it, the body has taken its head back. Exactly a year later, the knight returns to Arthur's court to return the blow. Caradoc bends down to receive the blow, but the knight delays, and Caradoc accuses him of cowardice. The knight gets ready to strike, but only touches Caradoc with the flat of his sword. And after praising Caradoc, he reveals he is in fact his father, the sorcerer Eliavres. Now, of course, there are some differences there between the versions, but these differences do not justify the theory that there existed another version of the story now lost. If that is a theory you want to read, you can find it in the Tolkien and Gordon edition. What these differences show is simply that the Gawain poet felt under no obligation to follow his source faithfully. There are other indications too of the poet's knowledge of the continuations, but I won't detail those. You can find those in my book Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and French Arthurian Romances. I just mention a few other romances which because the Gawain poet is certainly not alone in knowing the continuations. There is an episode, the episode of the Pucelle de Lys, which you can find in the continuations, that forms the basis of the Jest of Sir Gawain, which is usually dated to the second half of the 15th century. The basic story of the Jest of Sir Gawain is the same as that of the first continuation. Gawain sleeps with a lady that he finds in a tent, but he is interrupted by her father, who challenges him to combat. Gawain defeats first the father, then fights her two brothers. He defeats the first, but the second, Sir Brandles in the Jest of Gawain, it's Brandelis in the French, holds his own against Gawain. And to end the stalemate, the two combatants agree to resume the duel when their paths cross. In the first continuation, battle is rejoined many lines and many adventures later, but again the English poet wanted to keep the story short and simple, and he proceeds briskly to a just and patriarchal conclusion. Sir Brandles beats up his sister to teach her a lesson not to sleep with strangers, and he nurses his father and brother back to health, and then there's a happy ending. Even later is the Scottish Golagros and Gawain, extant in a printed edition published by Chapman and Miller in 1508. This romance strings together two episodes from the first continuation. First, the adventure of Kay and Gawain as they seek hospitality for King Arthur and his knights on their travels. And then there is the adventure of the Riche Soldoyer. A knight is defeated by Gawain, but in order to save appearances, Gawain pretends to be the loser and allows himself to be taken to Golagros's castle as his prisoner. Arthur and his courtiers despair, but their mood lightens when Gawain reappears triumphant, accompanied by his opponent, who surrenders himself to the king. Both episodes revolve around Gawain's courtesy, and in that regard the Scottish poet managed to create a coherent and, in the context of English romances, a characteristically short romance. This really is a feature when you look at the way the English poets adapted the first continuations. It was really a matter for them of cutting it down to size. They obviously thought that the length of the continuations in the French was quite unmanageable, and who can disagree? Leah might disagree. In conclusion, there's much more to be said, but it's time to wind up. There is actually plenty of evidence that Chrétien's Arthurian romances and the continuations were influential in England and Scotland. It is true that English language literature that in English language literature, the signs of this influence are late, because they come from 14th and 15th century romances. Ewain and Gawain, Sir Percival, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, The Jest of Sir Gawain, and Golagros and Gawain. But I think all this tells us is that what this tells us is that literature in English was itself late. His influence on insular literature before the 14th century is apparent in Anglo-Norman literature. And here we find evidence of it both in romances, Guy de Warwick, Ider, Fergus, and perhaps Ipomedon, and then sometimes in more unexpected places like Rossignol, the visual arts, round table feasts, and that remarkable mention of Chrétien de Troyes and his romances in the commentary on Merlin's prophecies. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop there. I will share, actually, as I do have references for people who are interested in it. You can, of course, just email me, and I'd be very happy to share with you a longer version of this. But here, for completeness, some references.
Fabulous, Ad. I think everybody is joining in the clapping. By tradition now online, we don't do the actual clapping, but we're all here to thank you. Diolch yn fawr. Merci beaucoup. Danke.